It's going.
Okay, so thank you for coming today. I basically wanted to show whoever was interested in this next gen framework. I wanted to show it off a little bit and just kind of show demo how it or what it is, because I know a lot of what we do with automation testing has been Selenium or Selenified, and this is just a different look at how to do automation testing. It's kind of spec driven, meaning that YAML specification files are kind of what define the test. So, a little bit of a history. When I started at Vibrant, it was, I think, a couple of weeks before April of last year, and they were just starting this framework. So I've kind of been there for the I wasn't there for the initial design, but it was really just one architect that was at Vibrant that kind of designed it. And what is good as well is it was as an engineer, someone who had a technical background, and he really wanted to. He really came up with a solution that was simple, extendable, and it's easy. Geez, it's easy to maintain. Um, and he was he allowed ideas to come in of people, but he was a strickler or stickler or whatever it is of not letting bad stuff come in, and I really appreciated it. And um, once he got it moving, he moved on back to development, and the framework has maintained most of its integrity. You'll see during the the presentation why maybe it's lost a little bit, but um, Georgie and myself have been working. I was solely on the framework. Georgie was kind of part of the team initially that was transitioning tests from the old framework to the new framework. But he has since been a developer as well on the next gen framework. So let's move to the next slide. What was the legacy framework? So the legacy framework was a hybrid solution of Selenium and Selenified, and they they wanted to get rid of the Selenium and Selenified for a few different reasons. One is it was kind of a black box. There were hundreds of spec definitions and lots of code written for a small amount of gherkin code on the front end. So it was kind of like, oh, I need to do another test, but there's no step available to me, so I need to create another step. And so it was getting really messy. And so one of the things I wanted to say is a lot of Coveros folks were the ones that built the legacy framework. So I don't want to be um, too negative on it. So I'll just keep that in mind. But um, at the time of my joining, there were over 1,000, I think almost close to like 1,500 um, tests that were written in the legacy framework. Less than 200 were running during a pipeline. And that was, I say, when they turned it on, because for a long time, they decided that because of the fragility of the tests, that they didn't even think they were useful and they turned them off. And I remember I wasn't on the team then, but I remember like a lot of like Max, I remember was very upset about that. And um, they had a lot of tests that were um, not run that were called, I forget the tag name, but basically don't run these tests, only run the select few. And so why were they doing that? Because the tests themselves were very fragile. And why were they fragile? Um, there was a lot of hard coding. There was a lot of duplicate code. There was a lot of what I call spaghetti code. It was each method in the code was, and this wasn't for everything. So some of the stuff like logging in and registering and things like that had been kind of put aside and not duplicated. But for anything that was specific, they had specific code for a specific uh, gherkin step. And it was just getting out of hand and very hard to maintain. And a lot of the tests weren't running anymore. And so they were like, we got to figure out a way to make it much easier for the QA or the manuals who want to use this, or even the testers to write tests and not be so dependent on a framework, and not have to update that framework anytime something changes. And like I said, a very black box. You'll see like it might be a very common statement, Gherkin statement, and then there was a whole bunch of stuff that happened on the back end. And if you weren't very good at Java, you wouldn't be able to follow it, or maybe you didn't even look at the Java to see what was going on. And again, majority of the team was new to Java, yet the majority of the tests were written in Java. And what you get is a lot of spaghetti code when that occurs. And the team was rather large, so there were a lot of people writing tests, and there really wasn't a standard. There's also some third-party tools um, that required a ton of code and setup to be added. One example would be the NG or the test NG reporting that was there. There was a whole bunch of setup that had to occur just to get the reports to show up after the pipeline ran. So those are a bunch of the reasons why they were like, we need to figure out something. So in came the next gen framework idea. And the idea was something simple, lightweight, very small footprint that um, that wasn't going to get extended and spaghetti coated all over the place. And right now, I think when we released it initially, there were less than 20 steps. There are now 34 steps, mainly because new programs came on to test, or there were some new things that we needed to test. So we had to create a couple of additional steps. Some of these steps are specific to Vibrants program. The majority of them are not, but the ones that are more like what you'll see, the form creation or submission and kind of the registration of a user are more specific um, to Vibrant. But the idea was to write a framework where you could test any program, any site, it didn't matter. We actually, in the framework, our automation tests that we have as examples are just testing Google, um, just to show that the majority of our steps are testable with other sites. The whole thing also was like the peer. Everyone's familiar with the top of the pyramid test, like unit and integration. As it builds up, it gets to the like system and automation, like functional test that tests the function. And the idea of this was the framework is going to be used as as functional web testing. The old framework had a lot of API tests in it, and it was like that's not where API tests belong. API tests belong with the API code, and so there was a whole initiative to move all those API tests into integration tests in the code. Number one, they will get run much earlier, and the people who are in control of the REST and the APIs will then be in control of the test versus the test being somewhere else, not co-located, and people that really aren't that familiar with what the API is doing, writing those tests. The other idea was to use specification files, YAML specification files, for both the user and page data, and I'll be going over this, but really it allowed for a much more dynamic test. It allowed for the person writing the test to be in complete control of the test and the workflow, and really removing kind of that black box, like, I don't know what this is going to do. And a little bit of a con there is that the tests themselves got much bigger. The Gherkin is a lot bigger than what it was, but the pro is they're in complete control of what they're doing, and it's very easy to follow a test and see what every step is and see why it failed and where it failed. Another thing with the next gen framework is type safe code. We're using the actual DTOs from the core API repo versus JSON objects. Some of the benefits there are if they update some of their DTOs and we're testing with JSON objects, the calls will start failing and we don't really know why. But in the case of when you're using the DTO and passing those DTOs, our code won't compile if they have updated their DTOs. And we also, it was new to me, but we're using Retrofit 2 and OK HTTP 3 for all the REST calls, handling the calls. And instead of TestNG, we're using Cucumber reporting, which was built in with the code we were already using. All right, so a quick demo. I'm not actually going to demo. This is more of a walkthrough of a lot of the code and things. So the first thing I wanted to show you actually was the code, just the repos. So we have an automation test framework repo, and then there are 5 repos that are using this. And these are all the different programs that we're testing in Vibrant. So every single one of these guys, and I will be showing you PMI because that's the one that's built out the most. But basically, they're just using the framework for all of the work, and all the tests are written in these. One of the things that Benoit, who was the architect, was big on was making sure that we had a lot of documentation. So I just wanted to kind of show all these ADocs are documentation that's with the code, living with the code. There was a big push for us to have Confluence pages and put all the documentation in there. And we pushed back saying, you know, as soon as you finish writing the Confluence page, it's going to be out of date. So what we ended up having is a Confluence page that basically just links back to all of this documentation, and it made everybody happy because now we're not worrying about out of date documentation, and they have their Confluence page. So one of the things I wanted to show you is just the step definitions that we have. I'm not going to go through every one, but you can see which ones actually are kind of API specific. And then all the ones that are UI interaction are the ones that really could be used for any site. And right now there are 34 steps. Here's all the definitions and kind of just documentation. This stays up to date as the code changes. We try to make it a requirement when anybody updates a step, there's a file they run that will generate this page, this document, updating anything from the step name, descriptions, parameters that are passed in. So it stays pretty much up to date, and you could use this if you weren't sure exactly what to do. But now we also have, you know, hundreds of tests, and it's very easy just to kind of look at what you did at another test to figure out what to do. But there's tons of documentation that we've written, and I'll mention documentation again in my last slide, but we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what to document, how to document, so that people could read this. Just like any other framework that you're about to use, there's documentation. You know, if you're going to do Helm charts or Kubernetes, you're going to read up on the documentation before you just dive in and say, I can't do anything. And we try to do that with a lot of this. So one of the first things I wanted to show was just that, but then I wanted to kind of discuss the page and the user specs, because this is where I think it becomes very different from what we've been used to in the past with Selenium, but also I think very powerful. And it allows you to be very dynamic. So one of the things, let's see, we would create a page schema and a user schema, and this is based off of a user DTO. This is based off our page schema, which is kind of how all our tests are driven. And the page schema is basically, let me show you an actual page schema so that we can follow through. Let's see, pages, doesn't really matter. Yeah.
So this is all custom built. It's not layered on top of any existing framework, you're saying?
The only framework that we use is for like the elements and stuff is Selenide, for like the clicking of elements and things like that. But besides that, everything's custom built.
And you said the reason to do that was because the like the existing frameworks provided too much functionality that was being abused, or is that, and this limits what you can do with it, or?
I wouldn't say that. No, it was what we did is we limited the steps to 34 steps, which for the most part, I would say 95% covers all of the functionality that the old legacy system used, just much cleaner, much simpler.
How do you have different implementations for the steps? Like, for example, then I click on whatever. You have some mechanism of choosing amongst a variety of implementations for that?
Yeah, and that's kind of what I'm going to go through right now. So this is a page specification, and a page specification is going to describe all the elements on a page. It's going to describe or define actions that you can create. So if you had like the login where you had to go to a page, click on this, enter this, click on that, and then hit login, you can make an action that does all those steps for you at once. And they're defined in here. And then I'll talk about the API page in a little bit, but this is for form submission through the API versus doing it through the UI. But each element is associated to an element on the page, and then it has locators associated to it. So for testing the web, you have the web device. And another thing with Vibrant is they don't have IDs hardly anywhere in their code, and it seems to be very difficult to make them put IDs in. But obviously, if there was an ID, we would use that as the locator. You can see the locator. This doesn't have the locator type is XPath. There's ID and CSS. There's all different kinds of locators. But another thing that's here is this defines the page, but then you have the locator for web, Android, and iOS. So you're using the same page spec to write your test or for everything. So no matter what, you're looking for first name. How you find it on Android, iOS, or the web is going to be different, but you define it right here. So this page spec is what's used to test all three devices. So the middle initial, and the API is, again, just dealing with the form submission, which I'll talk about later. So this is what defines your page. And then you have user specs that you can use that will define a user. So when you create a test, let's go to a test real fast. Basics feature. When you create a test, you can choose a user, and then all the pages that you are going to test, you would just change the page spec to that page. So in this case, you're an Alabama user created by the API, which is going to go register the user, and then you're going to submit a few different forms via the API. And the reason we're doing this is because the test that we're actually testing is further down, and there's a workflow at Vibrant where in order to get to certain pages and stuff, you have to complete a certain amount of forms to get to another form. So to test form 5, we would submit the first 4 forms through the API. Number one, it's a lot quicker, and 2, it would shrink down the amount of code you're writing in the Gherkin. But to go to a page, you would just say, I changed the page spec to, and then the page that you're supposed to be going to. And then you would interact with the elements on that page. So clicking elements, filling out an action here. And I don't know if that answers your question, Byron, but you're basically interacting with page specs, and you in the user that you are using for the test, you can grab their information out of there as well. It's stored. So like if, and a lot of this stuff you're actually entering user information. So you would then enter the user information for that. Let me find primary consent. So in this one, you're actually going through the form without submitting it via the API. So you're changing your page spec to a page, you're doing whatever, you're verifying that you're there, you select yes, you click the next button, you go to another page. So while you can see it's a lot more gherkin, you can also tell exactly what you're doing. And it's all driven by the user. So if there was logic that said, if I'm an Alabama user, I'm going to have a different page than this one, maybe it's just a different page, you can, knowing that whatever user you choose, you would define whatever, the workflow is.
Hey, Bob,
Yeah,
is this all one test that you're showing?
this one is, yeah.
That's quite a test.
Well, and you guys are reacting very similar to how the people reacted when we showed them the framework.
Wow.
But I don't know if George is here yet, but if he is, he could tell you what he thinks of it. But yes, it's a test, but it's also a giant form. And so what they had before, and I'll go through that in a little bit, is they would have, and I submit the primary consent form, and if they weren't going through every step, if it was through the API, there were hundreds and hundreds of lines of code in the back end that did it. So any change that was made would then, you'd have to go figure out what was going on, change it in the code, rebuild the framework, and then run your test again. Yeah. Now, if an element changes, it's just simply something you do on your page. You would go into the page, you would update the element name or whatever changed. Maybe a lot of times you find it's the locator, and you would change it. But yes, I had mentioned before, the con of this is that you get large gherkin tests. The pro is you are in complete control, and someone who's not technical at all can write tests and have complete control of the flow, and it's very easy to read.
Right. Now, are you finding that non-technical people are writing tests for this? Who writes the tests?
Right now, it's been all automation test people, but I would say that they're not all technical in the way of, like, they're not developers.
Right.
So, and this whole idea was to move away from people having to write code to write tests.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be interested. Maybe at the end or something, I'd be interested to talk about, the merits of using something like Gherkin versus, scripting it other ways, kind of thing. But I don't want to dive into it now. I did have one little question though, which was, I saw one of the operations was change page spec to what, and I also saw somewhere navigate to some page. Like, does change page spec to something, is that resulting into effectively navigating to whatever that page was supposed to have been, or what does that mean?
No, typically in the change page spec, what's happening is when you clicked element next button, you navigated to the info page. So now we're changing to the page spec. We're just saying now we're going to use to info page to look at what elements there are. And so it's going to read in this page spec, and now you have the ability to do anything with these elements, or if there were actions on this page, you could call those actions. So changing the page spec does not change the page you're on the app. It just puts you to the definitions of the elements and actions that are on that page.
So that's the test framework loading that page spec into, basically the context of the page where you are right now.
Yes.
Perfect. That's cool.
For this, slightly unrelated, but if I don't ask, I'll forget. For like your CI process for the tests themselves, do you have any sort of linting or schema enforcement on those YAML files?
Yes. So in the CI process itself, we do not, but what we do have is we have schemas page schema 4 and user schema. And so in here, if you were, on the schemas, and I don't know why it's not showing up. None of that stuff is showing up, but there is a schema down here, and why it is not showing right now is beyond me. And you associate all of your schemas to that schema that's in the framework. The idea was to put those schemas somewhere where you didn't have to associate it to the framework schema. It would be up in like Nexus or Harbor, and you could just have the schema downloaded, and then it would be here. Why it's not showing up right now is bothering me, because I wanted to actually show that. Because what happens is you associate all of your pages to the page schema, and you associate all of your users to the user schema, and then it has code completion and things of that nature. Whereas here, we do not have that right now. Oh, we do. Maybe it's associated to it. So this kind of shows you all the different types that you could use for the locator. If you were to, I'm trying to, probably more on the user schema, you can see, like, if this was expecting, a number because it's a birth, and you put in an F, it will tell you that you have an incompatible type there. So while we don't have anything linting checking this in the code itself, if you associate the schemas, it will help you with code completion and all that. And since I think I was supposed to talk about this now anyway, but with the schemas, not the user, but with the page schemas, we actually have versioning. We always keep 2 versions of it. So if something changes, we create another version of the schema, but we allow some of the programs that maybe aren't ready to update to the new version to continue using the old version. So in this case, the last time we made a change, this page schema, it had elements, it had actions, and it had API and conditions. We removed conditions as a top level kind of object, and we put it inside actions. So now every action has a condition. And the reason we did that is initially we had thought that we would just have conditions like don't do this if this. And then it made sense to say, well, those really belong on the actions that you're doing. So don't do an action if this. And that's kind of the change that was made. So we created a new version of the schema. If you are new and you wanted to create a schema, there are 2 ways you could do it. You could copy and paste an existing schema, like, I need to create a user, so I'll just copy and paste this. Or we have scripts that generate a default schema, and I just wanted to show you those. This kind of just gives you a default page schema to just give you a head start on creating whatever you're creating, and then a user spec. And it kind of spits out just everything that you could actually put into the schema.
Question for you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, first, a statement. It appears that basically what you've done here with the JSON plus the Gherkin is to build, in effect, a domain-specific language that is a page object model that it's basically a programming language for running UI tests that is meant to be targeting, like you said, the non-technical user. That said, question 1, what's your experience been with this for debugging tests?
Very easy. Mm-hmm. I mean, you'll know exactly where it failed, and it pretty much tells you what failed from the reporting, which I will I will show in a little bit, but the report goes through each statement, each step, and tells you what passed and what failed.
Okay, and I'll look forward to seeing that part of the talk. But the other question was, has there been any significant UI changes while this framework was in use, and how did you accommodate that?
Significant. There'll be locator changes, and we'll have to find them. We run our tests every time we check in. Like if we checked in the PMI like framework, we're going to run all the smoke tests and make sure that they're working. We also run all of the tests 3 times a week separately. But yeah, if there's a locator change, we have to update our code. But it's updating, like going into a page spec and updating a locator versus going into the code, finding out where it is in the Java code and changing it there, and then having to rebuild that so that you can use it.
Okay.
So it kind of just changes where the failure is happening and how to fix it.
I see. Cool. Thank you.
And there's also been things where, oh, we've added in a new form or a new screen that needs to be part of the workflow, and our things won't have that. So it's just a matter of adding it. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was the form submission. This was kind of something that I spent a lot of time doing, and I'm a little bit proud of it, only because of the amount of code that I didn't have to use. So I'm going to give a quick example of, in the old framework, one form and how much code, and there's probably more to it, but this is just one form submitting. This page has 264 lines, and then this page has 711. And this is just one form, the consent form. And there's also a lot of other things. So like this add page, why isn't it going? That might be somewhere.
So wait, Bob, what you're showing us right now, this is their application code for the forms?
This is the legacy framework.
And, oh, the legacy test framework. Gotcha.
Yeah, and all of this stuff happened at the beginning of every start of the test, and it happened for every form, even if it wasn't going to be used. And it would get all this stuff and set them in a cache somewhere. And it was just, so what I'm showing you is just one form with this, and this was almost 1,000 lines of code. All of these things here are all the forms and workflows over on the left here. And there's also additional work that has to be done. So I started looking at this and banging my head against the wall and tried to figure out, I stepped through all the different code, everything it was doing, tried to figure out exactly what was going on. And what we ended up doing code-wise is as simple as we have, we have a form utils. It's just a quick utility class. And it's about 211 lines long. And then we have in our user API, we have a submit form entry, which is this method, and then this method. So just 2 little methods. And everything else is described in a page spec. So in the case of, we'll go to a page spec. I have to find one that has API stuff. So anywhere that we had to submit a form, because each form, it could be 20 pages long, 3 pages long, 50 pages long, and not every form page has to be submitted with data, but there is important data that needs to get submitted because it will, number one, put the data in the correct state. It might trigger business rules based on something, or it unlocks new forms, or it sends to a third party based on stuff. So we came up with every page, wherever you had to submit something, we would create this. And the question was, the people writing the test, are they going to be knowledgeable enough to know what the form name and form ID is for a test? And the answer was from everybody, yes. So we wrote a step that said, I submit form with the form name with ID and that ID. And from that, all you needed, and you already had all these pages, because the web, like going through the form itself, you would create every page. You just needed to add, for any page that had data, you had to add the API section. So primary, I'm trying to find a good one. It's right around here somewhere. For some reason, I don't know where it is anymore. Sent to join. Anything that, so this one doesn't have any API. This one has one thing. So it's the page name. They would have to do a little bit of research. And if I'm not going to go show you how they create their forms in this, but it's very easy to log in, go to the form creation, see what the page name is, see what section you're on, and then radio option 1 is linked back to the element. Where is radio option 1? Radio option 1, you'll have a device API. So you're looking for that field, and you're going to put that value into it. So we have pages now with a little bit of that information on it, and it submits every form with much less work than before. And so there's also the ability to, like, so when you submit a form, you'll say, oh, I want to submit the primary consent form. I want to include every page in the primary consent page, which is this folder, or in this folder, except for your age 18. And so this page wouldn't show up with this API page, but everything else would. And the reason you would do stuff like that is if there's logic in the flow based on a user that you've chosen, certain pages show up, certain don't, certain forms show up. The way you would handle that is just through an exclude of the page, because we need, in our organization, we want to put everything that's under the primary consent folder into this test, but then we just exclude one page. So it's basically super dynamic, all controlled by the user, because they're going to be the ones that control what they put in the API page. There's nothing really in the back end they have to worry about. So it's just very clean, very dynamic, very, I'll say it again, user controlled. They're controlling what forms, what pages, what values, versus everything being hard coded, not really knowing what's going on. They said, I'm gonna get to this state, and they are somehow there. But if something breaks, not a lot of people could start going through all of this code and trying to figure out where it is. So that was just one of the things that I wanted to quickly show. Where are we at time? 12:41. Another quick thing I wanted to show is just kind of retro fit, just kind of the look and feel of the code. I gotta get to the framework. So here's an example of just a class that's doing the API call. So basically have a post, you put the endpoint in, it's a multi-part, and we're using, is there any good examples here? User DTO there. If we go to the app config, you'll see security question DTO. It's just, we're passing in actual DTOs instead of JSON nodes. And this is really cool. This also allowed us to do like interception of a request call. So we had to integrate our framework with Keycloak. And so if we were making any kind of a call that required a key cloak token, we could intercept that call and then make sure we went and got the token. And we would store admin tokens and user token. We'd store admin tokens in a cache state. We would store user tokens in a scenario state. So each scenario would have a different user. But in our interceptor, it would say, hey, if we have this token already, don't go get it again. And all it would do is intercept the call, add that token into the header, and then continue on with the call. And it was pretty simple and very clean. Again, I think everything for the most part here is very clean and simple to follow. All right, reporting. I have a quick report. This one, I added Bobby tag to 3 things just to quickly show you what you could do. This is our report that comes up after like a pipeline run, or when we run locally, we can get to it. And this is it's not an out of the box Cucumber report. We did use a person's Cucumber report that open source, but basically you can see your scenarios, what tags were run, what steps were run, anything that failed. And if the failures were here, you would just see basically these things with the failures. But if you go into like basics, the scenario steps, you can see every step that was run. And so if there was a failure, it would be green, 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 and then red right here. And if there's a failure in the hook, there'd be a screenshot of what page it was on and kind of what it looked like at the time. But you'll know exactly what step failed because it's right here. And it would say like could not find the locator or something of that matter, or could not find the button. So looking at these tests, Byron, it was very easy to find out where something failed.
Have you seen any that were like confusing? Like it wasn't just missing a locator or something, but it was like state had been set up in an unusual way, and you needed to like look at the state deeper.
The most confusing one that I've seen is when it says initialization failed, and it will happen. It will happen mostly during an API call, and it looks as though it's the API call that it failed on that that caused the error. But the real issue is the very first time an API call is made, it goes and it caches data, and there's an initialization step on the cached data class, and it's something in there that's failing. So that's probably more of a fault on our logging, not giving a better reason for the failure. But that's been the toughest one, and it had nothing to do really with our test. What typically happens there is the last thing I was actually going to show you is everything that we have, like data, like configuration wise, is driven by environment variables. And a lot of times when we saw that initialization, it was a username or a password was incorrect for whatever whatever environment we were testing against.
Okay.
But everything being driven by configurations, again, pretty powerful. It helps, especially in the Docker container world and Helm charts, because we're able to configure all these environment variables via the charts or the Docker files. And let's see.
This is pretty new though, right? I mean, I think I saw in the report you have like several hundred of these tests now. Is that right?
On the report?
On the Cucumber report, I was just looking at the totals, and it looked like you had several hundred to...
I'm sorry. On this?
Yeah, if in the summary report at the very top, features, if you would click on features. So you've got kind of 208.
This is the lines.
208 lines, huh? Okay.
Yeah, I only included 3 tests here.
Oh, okay. How many tests would you say you have?
For the PMI framework, we probably have, I would say, close to 100 tests, but they're not all run at the same. We have smoke tests, we have system tests. But when we run our smoke, I think we have 44 smoke tests that would run, and that's just for web. We have all those tests also for, so I guess there'd be more than 100 because we have Android and iOS smoke tests.
Hmm.
Then we have the system tests.
And since you were mentioning earlier that the developers were balking at the idea of adding IDs to certain elements, that would also lead me to the conclusion that in general, the testers and developers are very much working in silos from each other.
Oh,
Would
yeah.
you say that you're spending some significant piece of time correcting tests because the developers are simply making changes and it's kind of on the shoulders of the testers to go back and correct tests so that it's accommodated?
Yes, there is very little. While there should be, we have people that are assigned to actually pay attention to this kind of stuff. Absolutely, we are very siloed. It's not like, I don't think anyone really likes it, but I think that causes some of the problems as well.
Mhm.
But yeah, there'll be changes, and the only changes that we are aware of prior to it happening are like large configuration changes, but the smaller things like element changes we find out when our test breaks.
So
Which
go ahead.
I guess they can find out too when their tests break, because we do run our tests on their pipelines.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask. So it is actually run by Jenkins then. So if they check in a code change or something which breaks a test or fails a test, then they at least have a way to find that out because a build will fail, hopefully. Yes? Question mark?
Yes.
Awesome.
Now, before, no. And there's two frameworks that build our code, and one of them had our test running, but would not cause it to fail. And I noticed that when I was updating to the new framework, and everybody was shocked to know that. And when I was updating the other framework to use our tests, they had it turned off, and they were shocked that the tests were turned off. And it's like, so they're all on now, which is good. So running out of time, I wanted to go through this last thing, kind of the framework transition. So the team was very skeptical to adopt this for the reasons you guys mentioned initially. A lot of Gherkin steps, and there was just a lot of negativity towards it. But I think once they finally got in and started using it, they liked it. They saw the power. The one con is tests are large, but I think the pros outweigh that. We wrote tons of documentation that explains a lot of things, and we told them to read it hundreds of times. And I can tell you probably with certainty that at least half, if not more, have still not read it, which is frustrating because they'll come back and be like, how do you do this? And it's like, it's right there. After we had release 2 of the framework, Madavi, who is in charge of the engineering group, wanted his team members to start to get more work within the framework and get used to Java, even though they're all supposed to be. And when this happened, we updated our check-in policy so that there had to be two approvers, and one of them at least had to be one of the 3 to 4 framework engineers that we said were good enough to make decisions, because a lot of spaghetti started to get thrown into the framework. We have gone back and refactored a couple of times to get rid of some of that, but it's kind of inevitable when all of a sudden you have from 3 people building to 14 starting to touch it because they want to learn how it's working. But ultimately, it's Vibrants framework, and their people should know how to use it. So we still see some fragility in tests. Like Byron mentioned, the elements can change, the locators. Sometimes a workflow changes. In that case, when workflows change, we're usually warned ahead of time. And then there are environment issues. The legacy framework encountered these. We're encountering these. A lot of them are around Keycloak, but some of them are just, I don't think that their application can handle like what we're putting at them. So like you'll see 2 of our tests fail for timeouts or something, and then we'll run it again and those pass, but 2 more fail. And we've tried to get them to look more into this to find out what's going on, because we don't believe it's an issue with our test. We believe it's an issue with the application, but I don't think they're on the same page as us. So it's a little frustrating. But there.
So there's
Nice.
Rich. I'd say that offhand, looking at this, the things that I like are that you've created a domain-specific language using Cucumber as a means, and it seems pretty clean and organized. The drawback that occurs to me is that now you've got a domain-specific language, but you don't have the same utility in terms of like refactoring things, like, for example, a rename, or like extracting to a method that you would have if it were a real programming language. Any thoughts about that?
I don't know if I understand what you said.
Byron, you're talking about like IDE support for automated
exactly.
refactoring?
Exactly. Because that's what you've done. Your tests are, in effect, a new programming language that you built using Cucumber.
Yeah, we do have code completion on our, I don't know.
Yeah, that code completion.
You're right, refactoring, different set of heuristics to actually be able to do and move stuff around.
If you were going to do a mass update of something, it would just be kind of a find and replace type thing.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, that could be a little bit of a downfall. They mentioned it as well, they being when we transitioned, and it was more if something changes like on a page and you have to change whatever it is, it was like you could just do a copy and paste or a find and replace. But yeah, noted.
Yeah, no, I think it's good. Bob, one of the questions I had is, now that you've written the test, or the framework and test to go with it, I'm curious about how coupled it is to the actual application implementation. Both from a framework standpoint, is it really, the step definitions and the code itself and the framework itself, is this reusable on something that would not be the Vibrant code, or is it pretty tightly wound?
The only thing that's tightly wound right now, and I think could be easily updated, is registration of a user. And then the form submission is obviously directly for everything else. Anything on that steps page. Yeah,
because where I'm going with this is the thought of reusing this pattern of implementation, or even the code itself. If you open source the framework, so to speak, what could be used and leveraged for doing other things versus obviously the specific stuff like the page definition or the page specs and whatnot.
Yeah, so I think everything that is UI interaction, even setup page is fine. All of these can work in any site. It's the API stuff, the form, and the creation of there's I become a user spec, or I become a random user, which will generate data for you. We could keep that kind of stuff, but the user spec would probably be different.
And clearly, like Keycloak integration and a few things there are coupled to that implementation.
But when you become a user, it actually doesn't log you in or register you. It just puts that user data into the test, the scenario, so that you can use that data.
Gotcha.
The ones that actually, these that are created by the API, we have this, which could be reused, the ability to run a postman collection. So you would give
Oh yeah.
the Postman data and run it, so that could be reused.
I'm very impressed with the amount of documentation you're putting on this. Good stuff.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot. Like you look at the spec info, it talks all about the user and page specs. I mean, it's good stuff.
Nice. Yeah, no, I agree. You guys have done an amazing job on this. This was super helpful as far as kind of giving an overview of what that framework really means and some of the problems that you guys went through of how to, make it extendable so that they can continue writing. And I think I saw a PMI and a Cricut and a few other whatever their kind of deployment configurations of how they configure a specific product for a customer, and you guys are able to test all those different ones.
Who all at Coveros is involved in this, by the way?
In the framework?
Yeah.
Just Georgie and I.
Okay.
I would say it took me a couple of months of even building the framework before I saw the power of the specs. So, like, I don't expect a 1 hour brown bag to show you guys that. And it took people that were starting to transition and write the test with this a while as well. But once it all clicked and how dynamic and how like easy it was to do logic and things, it was pretty cool. And I wanted to show it off a little bit to just show everybody like, hey, instead of Selenium and Selenified, which are page object model related or whatever, there's this other cool way to do it with spec driven kind of testing. And I kind of like it. I do see the downfall or the con again of tests being large, but I don't think that's that big a deal in the end.
It sounds like, but and tell me if this isn't an accurate perception, but Vibrant, the organization, has adopted this where they were, fighting a little bit more against Selenium and Selenified historically.
Yes.
Yeah, and it sounds like it's a better match for the skills and capability of the people that are on the Vibrant test team.
Absolutely. Like an example, all the API tests that did exist in legacy are transferred over to integration tests on the API, and I'm actually the one heading that and doing a lot of the work. I took the most technical in Java to work with me on those tests, creating them. And, not Georgie, he would have been better. Not Shreyas, who's really good. The most technical of the non-technical, which is about 11 people.
Yeah.
And he is having trouble understanding object-oriented programming. So, and that's who they had writing the frameworks in the past, are people that just didn't understand code.
Yeah, and organizationally that becomes you either have to train those people, teach and train, which can be challenging, or you have to have different people, or you have to develop the tools and framework to match the skills of the people.
And on that note, do you find that the company is willing to make the investment in their staff to give them time to level up, or are they always under the gun, got to get the next stuff out, don't have any time to actually improve themselves?
Yes, I do think, I think it was 2+ years ago, from what I've been told, that Madavi, again, who's the head of engineering, told every one of the people on the test automation team to learn Spring Boot and Java. And I don't think anybody did anything about it. And now it's time where they need to know it, and they don't.
Yeah, I mean, it's a problem that I talk about a lot in the classes, and I'm wondering that you're on the ground. Do you think that there's anything that could be done to like convince them or add something so that they're willing, or at least so they can see what they need to do? Because most companies are like, but we need the same productivity levels, so of course you can't slow down, but you need to slow down to actually adopt these things.
Right. No, I certainly think they've had the time. They don't have a lot of time right now.
Mm.
And a lot of them, I want to say, are afraid. They don't want to try new things. And the people that aren't afraid to try new things never get it done, to the point where like anything that had to do with deployments and pipelines, it was just Georgie can do it or Bob can do it because we don't know how to do what they do. And so now finally after 8 months, they're trying to do things, but it's good. And we tried to teach them, but there's a large learning curve, but at least they're now starting to try to do that. And I think most of that's because they've been told they got to start learning this stuff. They can't depend on 2 consultants that won't be there forever.
Really nice presentation, Bob.
Thanks.
It should be really useful in both thinking about Selenium and what we do with that going forward, and as input into Vibrant account management, kind of the account review process to see where we can learn from what your observations have been, which came out in this presentation.
Yeah.
That's all good, great information.
All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
All right. See you later.
All right. Bye.
Thanks, Bob.